Helen died on a Tuesday in October. I drove home from the hospital alone. I came inside. I sat in the chair, and somewhere in those first days and weeks, in the fog of it, in the particular disorientation of a house that had been full of someone for 54 years, and was suddenly not, I began making decisions. Most of them I didn't recognize as decisions at the time. They felt more like reflexes, or like things that simply happened in the absence of the person who had been making the days organized before. But looking back from 82, from 7 years of distance, I can see them clearly for what they were. 7 decisions that, made differently or not made at all, would have led somewhere much darker than where I ended up. 7 decisions that saved what remained of my life after the most important person in it was gone. I'm 82 years old. My name is Walter. Today I want to tell you about those 7 decisions, not as advice, because I don't believe in giving advice nobody asked for, but as the honest account of a man who found himself on the far side of the worst thing that had happened to him, and is still here, still going, still making the morning coffee in the green cup she bought at the fair in Bar Harbor in 1989, still here. And I want to say plainly, before I get into the 7, I do not think I was unusually strong or unusually wise, or unusually capable of navigating this. I think I was lucky, partly, in the specifics of my circumstances. 2 children who stayed present, a house that gave me something to be in, a trade that gave my hands somewhere to go. But I also think the decisions themselves were available to anyone, that the seeing of them and the making of them was within reach of most people in most versions of this situation, and that the primary thing standing between most grieving people in these decisions is not character or strength, but just the knowing that the decisions are there to be made. This is the knowing, or part of it. The first decision was to stay in the house. There was pressure in the months after Helen died to consider a different living arrangement. Not cruel pressure, no one was unkind about it, and the concern was genuine. The children worried about me in a house this size alone. The practical arguments were real. The house is 43 years old and requires maintenance. I'm not always able to do the way I used to do it. The driveway is long and the winters are hard, and the stairs get harder. And I was 73 years old, and suddenly the sole occupant of a house that had been built for a family. David mentioned it gently. Susan mentioned it less gently, in the way Susan does things, with the directness of a nurse who has watched too many people make decisions too late. And I understood what they were saying. I understood the love underneath it, and I made the decision to stay anyway. I made it for reasons I only partially understood at the time and understand more fully now. The house I built in 1971 is not a building to me. And it was not then. It is 53 years of a life. Every board of it cut and fitted by my hands. Every room of it carrying something of the specific decades of living we'd done inside it. Helen is in every room of this house. Not in a ghost story way. I don't believe in that. I'm a carpenter. I believe in what I can touch. But in the way that a person is present in any space they've inhabited fully and daily for 54 years. The kitchen smells like her, or I imagine it does. The garden outside the window has her shape in it, even now. Even half wild the way it went in the first 2 years before I found the energy to tend it. The floorboards creak in the particular way they've always creaked, and I know every creak the way you know the sounds of a house you built yourself, and the knowing is a kind of company that I didn't know I had until I thought about losing it. To leave the house would have been to leave the last physical space that held the full texture of the life we'd built together. Not the memories. I carry those. They're not stored in the walls. But the texture, the particular quality of morning light through the kitchen window, the view of the cedars she picked when she picked the spot for the house, the bend in the road she loved, the light she said was good. Leaving would have exchanged all of that for something more manageable and much less mine. And I understood in my bones, even in the fog of that first winter, that manageable was not what I needed. What I needed was mine. What I needed was the specific, irreplaceable 43-year-old mine of this house, with Helen's cedar chest in the bedroom, and her green cup in the kitchen, and her tools still in the garden shed, and the sound of the furnace coming on in the night. I needed to be inside the life rather than in a managed substitute for it. I made the decision to stay, and I believe it was the right decision. And 7 years later, I'm still in this kitchen looking at the same cedar trees she picked, and the looking still does something for me that nothing else would do in quite the same way. The second decision was to go back to the shop within the first month. I went back about 3 weeks after the funeral. Not because I had anything to make, not because there was a project waiting, not because I felt ready. I went back because I understood, without quite being able to articulate it at the time, that I needed to go back before the not going back became the habit. Before the shop became a place I was avoiding rather than a place I simply hadn't gotten to yet. I've watched what happens when older people stop returning to the thing that made them themselves, and the watching has taught me that the return gets harder the longer you wait, that the gap between the person and the practice grows if you give it time to grow, and that the practice, the specific, daily, embodied practice of doing what you know how to do, is one of the primary ways a person stays connected to themselves when everything else is in disorientation. I walked in, 3 weeks out from the funeral, and I stood at the workbench with my hand on the bench top, and I looked at the tools, and I didn't do anything for about 15 minutes. I just stood there. The smell of the shop came back to me, the way old smells do, all at once, immediate, pulling everything with it. 50 years of mornings in this space. And then I picked up the hand plane from the shelf. The old number 4 Stanley I bought secondhand in 1966 for $4. And I ran my thumb along the blade to check the edge, the way I've done 10,000 times. And the checking was Walter the carpenter. And Walter the carpenter was still in my hands, even when almost everything else felt gone. And the being in my hands was exactly what I needed to find. I didn't make anything that day. I sharpened the plane, and I looked at the wood on the sawhorses, and I went back to the house. But I went back. I went the next day, and the day after, and eventually the making started again. The small things, the toy boxes, the cutting boards, the cradle I made from the butternut I'd been saving, the cabinet for Susan's kitchen. And everything I made was proof that I was still capable of making, still a carpenter, still someone whose hands knew something, still here in the most essential sense, which is not the being alive sense but the being yourself sense. The shop saved me the way it had always saved me, which is by being the place where I am most undeniably who I am, where the question of who I am in the absence of Helen has no traction, because in the shop the answer is always the same. A man who works with wood, and the wood doesn't care about anything else. The third decision was to answer the phone even when I didn't want to. This is a smaller decision than the first two, in some ways, and in other ways it's the one that required the most sustained effort, because the wanting not to answer was not a crisis, not a drama, not something that announced itself as a problem. It was quiet. It was the perfectly understandable pull of a tired and grieving man towards stillness and solitude, and the not having to manage how he sounded. It was the 3 p.m. feeling of the call ringing and the calculation I could let it go to voicemail. I'm not up to this right now. I'll call back later. And later would become the next day, and the next day would become the day after, and the gaps would accumulate, and the people on the other side of the calls would learn, and slowly and without malice, that reaching me required more effort than it used to, that the connection they'd been maintaining was becoming unreliable in a new way, and they would, as people do, as people must, adjust their expectations downward, and the calls would come less often, and the less often would validate the withdrawal, and the withdrawal would deepen. I knew this was happening, or starting to happen, in the 3rd or 4th month after Helen died. I knew it because I'd watched it happen in other people, in the men I'd known who went quiet after their wives died, and were found, a year or 2 later, to have become much more alone than anyone had noticed in the interim. And I made a deliberate decision, not a dramatic one, not a declaration, just a quiet private commitment I made to myself one morning. To answer the phone, to pick up when David called on Sunday, to pick up when Susan called on Thursday, to pick up when Elaine Poulin from down the road called to see how I was doing, to answer even when I was tired, even when I hadn't slept well, even when the managing of how I sounded felt like more than I had available. To answer anyway, because the not answering was the beginning of a path I had seen enough people go down to know where it led, and the path led somewhere I didn't want to go, What I found, almost every time I answered when I didn't want to, was that the conversation was better for me than the voicemail would have been. Not always dramatically better. Sometimes it was just the ordinary catching up, the small news of lives being lived, the Tuesday evening weather of two people who know each other checking in. But even the ordinary catching up did something that the voicemail couldn't do, which was to locate me in relation to other people, to remind me that I existed in a web of ongoing relationships, to make the house feel connected to the world outside it rather than sealed away from it. The answer the phone decision was, in the end, the decision to remain available to connection. And remaining available to connection is what kept the connection from thinning to the point where it was no longer there when I needed it most. Let me be specific about one call in particular, because the general principle is easier to accept than the specific reality of it, and I think the specific reality is worth saying. It was a Wednesday evening, maybe 4 months after Helen died, and I was having one of the worst evenings of those first months, a specific grinding kind of hard that I associate with the particular combination of physical tiredness and grief that arrives in the evenings, when the day's effort of simply functioning has been spent, and there's nothing left to hold the grief back from the surface. The phone rang. It was a man named George, someone I'd worked alongside years back on a commercial project in Orono, someone I'd stayed in loose touch with over the years, but who I'd rarely spoken to in depth. He was calling because his own wife had died 8 months earlier, and someone had mentioned Helen, and he was calling the way people sometimes call in grief, not because they have something particular to say, but because the calling is itself the thing that needs doing. I almost didn't answer. I was tired in the specific exhausted way of that evening, and the thought of managing a conversation felt beyond what I had. I answered anyway, and we talked for almost 2 hours, about our wives, about what the evenings were like, about the specific way a house changes when the person who made it a house is gone, about the things we'd done wrong while they were alive, and the things we'd done right and the things we hadn't gotten to. It was one of the most honest conversations I'd had since Helen died, and it left me, when we finally got off the phone at almost 10 o'clock, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, the particular warmth of having been genuinely known by another person, of having said true things and had them received without management or flinching. George and I have had coffee twice since then. He understood me differently from my children or my old friends, because he was in the same specific place at the same specific time. And the mutual understanding of that was its own kind of company. None of that would have happened if I'd let the call go to voicemail. The fourth decision was to say Helen's name out loud. I've talked about this in other conversations, but I want to say it here in full because I think it was one of the most important things I did, and one of the least obvious. After she died, there was a period, it lasted about 6 months, maybe a little more, during which I stopped saying her name. Not because I wasn't thinking about her. I was thinking about her constantly, the way you think about the thing that's changed everything, the way you can't not think about it. But saying the name out loud, to another person, in the course of a conversation, felt like touching something too hot. Like it would make the reality of it more real rather than less. Like the name, spoken into the air, was a key that would open something I wasn't ready to have opened. And so I referred to her indirectly. She, when I couldn't avoid the reference, or I simply didn't bring her up. Even when something in a conversation would have naturally led there. Even when there was an obvious moment when a person who wasn't managing their grief might have said Helen used to say, or Helen and I used to go there. I let those moments pass, and the passing of them created a particular kind of silence around her name that began, over those months, to feel like erasure, like I was participating, through the not naming, in her disappearance from the world. It was David who broke this without knowing he was breaking it. He came up about 8 months after Helen died, and we were in the garden, the part of it where she'd planted the lupines, and he said without preface or ceremony, "Mom loved these." Not she loved these. Mom. He said her name, and the sky didn't fall, and I didn't collapse, and the grief that arrived with the name was real and sharp, and exactly proportionate to what it should have been, and it passed in the way that the sharp griefs pass, and what was left was something warmer than what had been there before. She was briefly more present, the specific person, with the specific love of lupines, and the warmth of her presence was more than the ache of her absence. I started saying her name after that, deliberately, in conversations where she was relevant, and sometimes in conversations where she wasn't strictly relevant but where she belonged anyway, because she had been the person at the center of everything for 54 years. And the fiction that I could have a conversation about almost any subject without her bearing on it was a fiction I was tired of maintaining. Helen would have thought this. Helen would have loved that. Helen always said. The saying of it brought her back, in the small, specific way that language can bring things back, and the being brought back was better than the silence that the not naming was maintaining. She stayed in the world a little longer every time someone said her name. I intend to keep saying it for as long as I have breath to say it with. The fifth decision was to let the children help without making them feel they were taking something from me. I was raised the way most men of my generation were raised, to receive help as a last resort, and to make it clear, even when accepting it, that I hadn't needed it as much as it might look like. You handle your own business. You show that you can still handle it. You accept the help with a quality of provisional gratitude that communicates, I could have managed this myself, but I appreciate the gesture. It's a way of receiving that I've practiced for 80 years. And it served certain purposes. It preserved a particular kind of self-image. It maintained the dynamic of not being a burden. It allowed me to accept assistance without feeling diminished by it. But it also communicated something to the people offering the help that undercut the offering. It communicated, this isn't really needed, which meant your help isn't really needed, which meant you aren't as important to this situation as you thought you were. And the people who heard that, even without it being said explicitly, tended to offer less next time. After Helen died, I noticed this in myself, and I made a decision to change it. Not all at once. The habit is deep and the changing is slow, but deliberately over the months and years that followed. When David came up and split the wood, I stopped saying I could have gotten to that this week and started saying thank you. That means a lot. When Susan called to check on me and asked whether she should come up, I stopped saying, I'm fine. You don't need to, and started saying yes, I'd love that. Come when you can. When Elaine from down the road brought food over in the first weeks, I stopped receiving it with the managed gratitude that signals this was unnecessary, and started receiving it with the full gratitude that says, this was exactly what I needed and you knew that and thank you. What changed when I changed this was the nature of the help itself, but more importantly, the nature of the relationship around the help. The children stopped feeling like they were imposing when they helped. They stopped having to negotiate with my dignity every time they wanted to do something useful for me. The help became a natural part of the relationship rather than a special case that had to be carefully managed around my self-image. And without that management, without the energy spent on both sides maintaining the fiction that I didn't need anything, the relationships opened up. There was more room in them, more room for the actual things, for the real conversations, the honest check-ins, the genuine connection that is always the point even when it appears in the form of split firewood or a Thursday drive up from Boston. There was a moment about a year after I changed this that I want to tell you about, because it captures what the change actually produced in the relationship. David had come up for a weekend, one of the November visits, and on the Sunday morning before he left, he came into the kitchen early and stood at the counter and made coffee the way I make it. He'd learned it without my noticing when, just learned it from years of watching. And he brought me a cup in bed. Not because I'd asked, not because I needed it, not because I'd been doing poorly, just because he wanted to do it. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom with the cup and he looked at me for a moment and said, "How'd you sleep?" And I told him honestly, I'd slept badly the way I do sometimes in November. And he sat down on the edge of the bed and we talked for half an hour before the day started. Just talked. About nothing urgent, about nothing that needed handling. Just two people in the morning, father and son, being with each other in the specific low-key intimacy of an early morning before the day makes its demands. That morning happened because I'd stopped performing the I can manage this myself routine, which had been taking up all the space that the genuine moments needed in order to arrive. When I stopped performing, the genuine moments came. It turns out they'd been available all along, just crowded out by the management. The sixth decision was to find something to look at every day. This sounds too small to be a decision that saved a life. I understand that, but let me tell you what I mean by it. Because what I mean is larger than the words suggest. After Helen died, I was in danger of becoming the kind of man who moves through his days without seeing them. Not because I was unhappy exactly, or clinically depressed in the way that announces itself as something requiring attention. I was just not noticing, not looking at things. Moving from the bed to the kitchen to the chair to the shop and back. Attending to what needed attending to, getting through the days efficiently, and not really letting any of it land. The morning light through the kitchen window was just morning light. The cedars outside were just cedars. The work in the shop was just work. Everything had a faint coating of gray over it that kept it at a slight remove, kept it from being fully received, kept me from being fully in it. I noticed this, and I named it to myself, and I made the decision to fight it in the most direct way I knew how. By finding one thing every day that was beautiful enough or interesting enough or specifically lovely enough to stop for. Not to photograph, not to document, not to tell anyone about, just to actually look at. To let the thing land rather than moving past it. The particular way the frost clung to the inside corner of the shop window one morning in January. The grain of a piece of butternut under a good light. The figure in it that looked almost like something, the way wood sometimes has almost pictures in it if you look right. The chickadee at the feeder with his particular method of taking a seed and flying to the birch branch to open it. The way he'd sometimes sit there after, looking around at the yard as if he owned it. The October light on the cedars, always the October light on the cedars, which is a specific and unrepeatable thing that I've seen enough times to know I don't have an unlimited number of them left. I started a list on a yellow legal pad in the kitchen drawer, and I kept it. I've been keeping it for 4 years now. 1 or 2 things a day, written down at the end of the evening, just the small record of what the day actually contained that was worth noticing. Some days it's hard to find one thing, February days particularly, but I've never once had a day where there was genuinely nothing there. Something is always there. Something is always worth the stopping, always worth the actually looking rather than the walking past. The list is the evidence, on the bad days, when the gray comes back and the grief is particular, and the house is very quiet. I can open the legal pad and see what was there on Thursday 2 weeks ago, and what was there in October, and what was there last February when it was all so hard. And what was there is always enough to make the present seem possible. The looking at things decision was, in the end, the decision to keep being in my own life, rather than moving through it at the slight gray remove that grief can make into a permanent condition if you let it. I want to add something about what happened to the shop when I brought this practice into it. The shop has always been a place where I looked at things. It's inherent to the work. You have to look carefully at wood to know what it wants to become. You have to look at a joint to know whether it's right. You have to look at a surface to know whether one more pass of the plane will finish it or ruin it. But the looking had been functional. The looking had been in service of the making. What changed when I started the deliberate practice of noticing beauty was that I started looking at the shop itself, not just at the work. I started seeing the shop the way a stranger might see it. The tools on the wall, the particular order of them, the way the winter light comes through the west window in the afternoon, the smell that's been there for 50 years. I started seeing Helen's handwriting on the old coffee can she'd labeled Screws in 1982, still on the shelf where she put it. I started seeing the marking gauge she'd given me for Christmas in 1989, still in the same spot I'd put it then. I started seeing the shop as a record of the life rather than just as the place where the work happened. And the seeing of it as a record changed the quality of my time in it, made it richer, made it more present, made it a place where I was genuinely somewhere rather than simply doing something. The looking at things practice is what I'd call the antidote to the gray remove. You can't be at a gray remove from your life and also be looking at it closely. The two conditions are mutually exclusive. If you look closely enough at the ordinary stops being gray. It starts being what it actually is, which is the whole world. The 7th decision, the last one, the one I've saved because it's the most personal and the hardest to say, was to keep talking to Helen. I talked to Helen. I've been doing it since she died, and I've been doing it less secretly as the years have gone by. And I've told some people about it. and the reactions have ranged from deep recognition to gentle concern. And I want to say plainly what it is and what it isn't because I think it deserves a plain accounting. It isn't delusion. I know she's gone. I don't think she's in the room or that she answers me, or that the conversations go anywhere beyond my own interior. I'm a carpenter from Maine. I believe in what I can touch, and I can't touch her, and I know that. It isn't grief that hasn't resolved into acceptance. I've accepted her death, in the sense that I know it's permanent and I'm not waiting for something to reverse it. It isn't even primarily about grief at all. What it is this. Helen was the person I talked to. For 54 years, she was the primary recipient of my interior, of the things I was thinking about, the things I'd noticed, the things that had happened in the shop or in the world, or in my own mind that I wanted to share with someone. I talked to her the way I breathed, constantly, effortlessly, as a basic function of being alive and conscious in the world. When she died, the talking didn't stop, the impulse to say things to her, to tell her what had happened, to ask what she thought, to describe the chickadee or the grain in the butternut or the frost on the shop window. The impulse didn't stop, it just had nowhere to go. I decided to let it go to her anyway. Not to make believe she's here, I know she's not here. But to honor the 54 years of habit, to keep the channel open in some form, to refuse to let her death be the end of our conversation when the conversation had been the primary thing between us for most of my adult life. I talked to her in the mornings, quietly, in my head usually, sometimes out loud when I'm alone in the shop. I tell her about the grandchildren. I tell her about the lupines in June, whether they came up thick. I tell her when something good happens, when David calls and sounds like himself, when Lily sends a letter, when a piece of wood comes out right. I tell her when something is hard. I tell her I miss her, because I do miss her, every day in the background of things, and the saying of it out loud, even to someone who can't hear it, even to the empty shop, even to the morning air. The saying does something that the not saying doesn't do. It keeps her present, in the specific way that language keeps things present. It keeps her in the world of spoken things rather than letting her recede entirely into the world of the unspoken. It keeps the conversation going, in a form, in the form that's available, which is the only form I have. I know this sounds like something a man says who hasn't fully let go. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's something a man does, who has fully understood that the person he loved was not a phase of his life but the central fact of it, and who refuses to let the ending of her life be the ending of her presence in his. The talking keeps her present. The talking is a decision I made and remake every morning, and the remaking of it, the daily choice to keep the channel open, is one of the things that has kept me most fully alive in the years since October 2017, when the house went quiet in a way I hadn't known a house could go quiet, and I had to learn slowly and imperfectly how to be in the quiet without disappearing into it. The fires burned down to coals. The morning is gone. Outside, the November light is doing what it does, flat and honest and not asking anything of anyone. Just being November, being late in the year, being the particular quality of gray light that I've come to find its own kind of beautiful, after 82 years of seeing it. 7 years since Helen died. 7 years of the 7 decisions, made and remade, and imperfectly kept and kept again. I'm still here. The shop still smells the way it's always smelled. The feeder is full. The legal pad is in the kitchen drawer with 4 years of one good thing a day. The green cup is on the table where it always is. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the running conversation that doesn't stop, I'm telling Helen about the morning, about the fire and the light and the cup, and the fact that I'm still here, still going, still in this house she picked the spot for, still looking at the cedars she said had good light, still here, still talking to her, still finding every morning that there is enough to make the getting up worth doing and the day worth inhabiting and the life, the long, imperfect, irreplaceable, continuing life, worth living. If anything I said today reached you, you can subscribe to walk with me a while longer. I read every comment. Tell me what decision saved you. Tell me what you're still working out. I'd like to know. Take care of yourself. Answer the phone. Say the name. Go back to the shop. Look at the light on the wood. Let the help in. Write down the one good thing. And if there's someone whose name you've been not saying because the saying of it is too large and too real and too close to the center of the thing you've lost, say it today. Say it out loud. Let the name be in the air. Let the person be present in the specific way that naming makes things present. They deserve to be named. You deserve to have said it. And the saying, I promise you, does not make the loss more real. It makes the person more real. And the person being real is worth the ache of it. The fire's still going. I'll see you next time.